So yeah, again, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, based on wherever you are. And as mentioned, my name is Allan Kristensen. I lead the solution engineering team at AppOmni, and I want to thank the Flowsome team for inviting us to speak at this Salesforce DevOps Summit. I also want to thank all of you for attending this session. I plan on spending the first 20 to 25 minutes on three main topics, and then we'll of course open it up for questions at the end. So the first piece I'll start with is to talk a little bit about why SaaS security is a challenge, and I'll combine that with a couple of real life examples. And then I'll, after that, talk a little bit about, provide you with an AppOmni solution overview and explain how we help our customers secure their Salesforce environment on a daily basis. The third section is then where we'll talk about our joint Flowsome AppOmni DevSecOps solution and how we can integrate AppOmni into, the DevSecOps processes on the Flowsome side. And then we'll open it up for questions at the end of it, as we talked about. So I know a lot of you have most likely seen this slide many times before, but I still feel like I wanted to bring this up and start with this one because it is actually what we are experiencing every single day at AppOmni. First of all, customers are adopting SaaS very rapidly, as all of you probably know, and this is a fact and this is happening. So the left side there, I think Gartner got that right, and it's what we're seeing out there all the time, every day, right? Secondly, SaaS applications are complex and dynamic systems with multiple administrators managing these applications, which makes it very hard to get your security controls and posture right. And we definitely experience that every single day when we engage with customers, either for a POC's risk assessment or production deployments. The right side here, I would say, is a real challenge and it's a real threat as well. So I think that's actually spot on as well. And then I would also highlight that very few customers currently have continuous security monitoring and visibility into their security posture of their SaaS applications. And that's what leads to these security incidents and data exposures we're going to talk about here in a few seconds. So I want to start out with this slide to just show you a couple of real life examples of what's been happening recently, where if you look at the left side, this is an example of a compromised third-party application, which was leveraged to gain access into the Teespring infrastructure without Teespring having visibility into it. Lack of visibility, in this case for third-party applications, is a very common challenge and something that we see every day when we engage with customers. In the middle, you actually see a very interesting example of a SaaS security controls that was automatically pushed to a customer Salesforce infrastructure, which left data exposed to the internet for 5 years. It's also a very common challenge because SaaS applications are living systems that constantly change and update, and without continuous monitoring, it's nearly impossible to get your SaaS security settings and controls right. It's also important to note that a lot of new SaaS security controls are often not released in the most secure state or with the most secure value. And the main reason for that is that if you are too tight on the security controls, it could impact your user experience. So the middle one is actually a really good example of where new controls were pushed out, but the customer didn't have visibility into it. And it's a good example of where it's the customer's responsibility to get these things right. And without continuous monitoring, it is really hard to stay on top of all these different moving parts. And on the right side, I think all of you have seen this before, but I still wanted to bring it up, the SolarWinds attack. I think the main thing on the right side is really that traditional security protections and systems didn't help catch these things. So I think it's also an example of where what you might have, what customers generally have in place is not necessarily enough for SaaS security monitoring. And that's something we're going to talk a little bit about as we move through this session. So with that said, I want to talk a little bit about what is AppOmni all about, what do we provide, and then we'll move into how we then work together with Flowsome afterwards. So I think the first part on the top right, in the top right corner, where we talk about discovery. This is where I usually present this like, we want to know how good or bad or ugly it is. So it's getting connected to customers, in this case, Salesforce environments, start to get visibility into what's the current state of the environment, what's the data exposure, and what's the shared internally and externally in your environment. The next piece is then, of course, now that you know the state of the environment, look at what should your guardrails be and how do you then pick your policies and deploy these policies. And we're going to talk about that in a couple of minutes here as well. And the last piece is at the bottom there, the monitor section, is to talk about actually put continuous monitoring in place, but also integrate it into your existing workflows and change management processes, security workflows, etc. So AppOmni covers the whole stack of discovering what you currently have, implement these continuous monitoring policies, and then also let you integrate into existing workflows. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the findings and some of the common things that we see when we engage with customers. We usually like to talk about that SaaS applications nowadays are very similar to, I would consider them, operating systems. They are super flexible, complex environments, constantly changes, a lot of administrators in the systems. And some of the numbers you see on this slide is based on what we see during risk assessments when we engage with customers. So you have different types of users coming into the environment. That could be internal users, external users. So if you look at some of these top numbers, numbers at the top, we do see that in 55% plus of our engagements with customers, you have data exposed to the public world, and the 55 number is actually how often we see data is exposed to anonymous users in the public world. And then we also see, as you can see in the top right corner, we talk about 95% of companies have external users, or external users have been over provisioned. So we pretty much in every single engagement we do with customers see that external users coming into, in this case, Salesforce, do have permissions to data they shouldn't have access to. So that's also a very common finding. If you move to the bottom of this, we do see a lot of third-party applications connecting to these SaaS applications, including Salesforce. And the numbers you see at the bottom, 42 and 22, is what we see in average across the risk assessments and engagements we've done with customers. So that talks to the use case we talked about a few minutes ago, where you have third-party applications connecting, and the customers often do not have visibility into what are these applications. And the one on the right side is, in average, these SaaS applications do have roughly 200 updates that goes out to SaaS applications on a yearly basis. So that talks to the middle use case we talked about a couple of minutes ago, where updates constantly go out, and it's very hard for you to gain visibility into it and know what these settings are and make sure they're set to the most secure state. So as we talked about a few minutes ago, AppOmni helps you get that visibility into what's happening. We help you put monitoring around these different things we talked about, and we help you then integrate into your existing workflows as well. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the different things we do before we move into the Flowsome conversation as well. So the first piece we usually talk with customers about is SaaS security posture drift detection. So think of that as configuration drift detection for your SaaS applications. The next piece we focus on is SaaS data access drift detection. So this is where we start to look at who has access to what and why, and give you visibility into where you have over permissive accounts provisioned. The third one on the left side, we call it SaaS functional testing. So this is where you can also start to look for minimum access. So this could be where you have certain users that need a certain set of permissions in Salesforce to perform their day-to-day job. And if those ones goes away, of course, they can't perform their day-to-day job, and support tickets are probably going to come in. So we're going to talk a little bit about that in a minute. And then, of course, SaaS compliance monitoring. It's also very hard for customers to understand how they stack up against the different compliance frameworks. So we'll talk a little bit about how we can help in that area. And I think the last piece on the left side is SaaS audit log monitoring. We all know that these SaaS applications generate millions of audit logs, and it's very hard for customers to make sense of these logs and also figure out what's important. So we're going to talk about each of these 5 things in a couple of minutes here, so you can get a little bit of sense of what we help with in each of these different areas. So let's talk about SaaS posture drift detection. As you guys probably know, Salesforce comes with somewhere between 250 and 300 different security controls, and new features and functions and controls continues to come out all the time. So a lot of questions we get from customers is, where do I even start? Which one should I care about? What's important? What's the risk for each of these ones? This is a little bit an example of something we can help with, where we have out-of-the-box best practices. So instead of you trying to become a SaaS security expert or Salesforce security expert, you can use our out-of-the-box policy, start with those baselines, and you can start to get risk scores back from the findings. On the right side, you can see a couple of examples from our default policy. As I said, we have default policies with roughly 70 best practices that we can deploy in minutes, and you get instant visibility into where is your Salesforce environment compared to best practices on our site. You can, of course, build your custom checks as well, but we want to make sure we have an easy button for you to get that instant visibility into the current state of your environment. So that's one very common use case on our site. The other part that's probably even harder for customers to get right is what we call SaaS data access, drift detection, or data access in general. Because if you look at Salesforce, if you look at internal users, external users, most users will usually come through some kind of UI, web-based UI, interact with Salesforce. You might have third-party applications, you might have mobile apps, etc. But in general, a lot of customers will come through a web UI. So that's what we're talking about at the top. And we are seeing a lot of customers are spending a lot of time on using user acceptance testing, security validation, and testing of everything that's exposed in the UIs. But the reality is that a lot of data is usually exposed by APIs that customers do not even know about. So doing validation testing and security testing based on the top of this slide only give you part of the puzzle, and there's a lot more that we can actually discover and identify when we start to do deep API scans of data access. So I want to give you a little bit of an example of how this can look like. So if you connect AppOmni to your Salesforce environment, think of it as we can do deep API scans of user personas. We can pick internal users, external users, integration accounts, whatever you have in Salesforce, and we can start to do continuous scans of what these types of users can get to. And we can first of all report back to you, what does that data access look like? As you guys probably know, in Salesforce, there are multiple sharing models, and these sharing models are overlapping, and it's very hard to calculate what is the net access to data for certain user types. So what you're looking at here is, for example, an external user coming into a Salesforce community portal. And as you know, community portal could be where customers could come and self-register. It could be a support portal. It could be a loan portal. It could be a patient health portal, anything like that where customers usually can self-register. So if you go ahead and self-register and you have your data access model and the data access sharing wrong in Salesforce, something like what you're looking at here could happen. These external users will maybe not have access to all these different types of data records in the UI when they interact with their community portal. But when we do these deep API scans of what the portal is actually serving and making available via APIs to these users, things like what you see on the right side is not uncommon for us to discover. We do see millions of records, and typically also pretty sensitive types of records that's exposed by APIs. So if you look at the example on the left side, this is something that's very hard for customers to answer. What's shared with my external community users, and why did that happen? So that's what we first of all can help you with from a data access point of view. And then we can of course put continuous monitoring in place. So it's not a point in time assessment, it's a continuous monitoring process that will alert you if anything gets exposed that shouldn't get exposed to external users. So let's talk about functional policies. So that's a little bit the reverse of what we talked about before from a data access point of view. This one talks about minimum access. So what you're looking at here is on the left side, a sales user coming into Salesforce. And what you're looking at on the right side is a data access policy, a functional policy in AppOmni that calls out or defines what's the minimum access my Salesforce user or sales users should have in Salesforce. So if you look at the lead line item on that screenshot, it basically tells AppOmni that sales users should have create, read, edit, delete permissions for leads. And the alert at the bottom will then show me that there are 10 open issues where these sales users have 10 permissions missing. One of them is the create permission for leads. So you know what's going to happen if you don't remediate this or fix this, then you'll start to get support cases logged by all your sales users because they can't create leads. So that's an example of a really strong IT or a functional use case that's very common for customers to use as well, and brings a lot of value to the Salesforce teams and IT teams. I want to talk a little bit about compliance as well, because for all these different controls and policies that we deploy, we also map our findings back to a list of different compliance frameworks. I just picked the NIST framework here, but we also have ISO, we have SOX, we have SOC 2, and a list of other ones. So we do that mapping on our site. So you should think of AppOmni as a solution that provides you with always on compliance reporting and visibility. So you can generate these reports whenever you want, and you don't have to do any of the mapping on your site. That's done by us. The next piece, and that's the fifth one I had on one of the previous slides. If you look at SaaS audit logs, this is an example of where you have cross SaaS applications But there's also a scenario where if you're just looking at Salesforce, as you know, Salesforce do have multiple audit logs, and each of the audit logs in Salesforce do have different formats. So that the net here is that audit logs in SaaS applications generally have different formats, and they don't use a standard format, right? So if your SOC analysts are let's say your SOC team is consuming these raw audit logs in a SIM solution, and your SOC analysts want to query these SaaS or these audit logs, and you want to put detection rules in place, it's very hard, first of all, to get your arms around the format of the audit logs. And secondly, it's very hard to also understand what are you actually looking for in these audit logs. So what we provide in AppOmni is, first of all, we can help you collect the audit logs, run them through AppOmni. We'll then normalize these logs. So all the logs across these SaaS applications, but also the Salesforce logs, will now be in a normalized ECS format. You can still send them to your SIM solution, and your SOC analysts will now have the raw audit logs, but they'll be in a normalized format, which makes it a lot easier for them to query them. But then on top of that, we do have a detection rules on our site. So instead of your SOC analysts having to create these detection rules to look for suspicious patterns in these audit logs, we have these detection rules in the product. So we'll automatically start to trigger and fire off alerts if we start to see suspicious activities across these audit logs. So this screenshot shows you a couple of examples where we have some brute force attempts. It could be mass data exfiltration. It could be data exposed to the outside, things like that. So this will help you. It's basically the easy button for audit log monitoring and visibility into what's happening. So this is the last one about AppOmni. Then I'll talk a little bit about Flowsome and AppOmni together and how we deliver a DevSecOps solution together. So we do a lot of these customer, both risk assessment, POC deployments, and of course, production deployments. And I want to bring up these numbers because they are kind of interesting, where if you look at the left top one, we talk about that 35% of these best practices that we ship with that out of the box is usually misconfigured. So for pretty much a third of critical settings is not set to the most secure setting. From a compliance point of view, we usually see somewhere between 30 and 40% of these mappings we have back to compliance frameworks that's out of compliance. And then we talked about data access. This is where I would argue data access is what gets you in the news, because this is where data is exposed sometimes to external users, but it could also be other things like third-party applications. But if you have your data access in Salesforce misconfigured, that's a critical thing. And unfortunately, in pretty much every single engagement we do, we do find data access misconfigurations, and quite often for external users as well. The 85% on the right side is where we talk about APIs being enabled in Salesforce. And then on some of these bulk exfiltration tools that comes with Salesforce, it could be Workbench, it could be data loader bulk, it could be other things. We do unfortunately see that in 85% of these engagements, we see that ETL apps are enabled for non-administrative users together with APIs enabled. So you can probably see this could actually expose data to a lot of users very quickly, right? At the bottom, we see in a little bit more than 50% of our engagements, we do see data exposed to the anonymous world. We talked a little bit about that earlier, so it's a pretty high percentage, and it's something that customers typically get surprised about. And in 95% of plus of our engagements, we do see these third-party integrations connected to Salesforce are over permissive, and they do have both permissions they shouldn't have in Salesforce, as well as access to data. So if you have a third-party applications that can, for example, provision users, it can create certificates, it can manage IP addresses, those types of things is usually things you don't want to have assigned to your general integration accounts. We do see Salesforce is often used to store secrets as well. It's not what it's intended to be used for, but we totally get that sometimes there might be a need for it, but customers simply just don't have visibility into it. So just to give you a little bit of sense of what we typically are seeing out there. So let's talk a little bit about our integration with Flowsome and your DevOps or DevSecOps process. So some of the things we just talked about, you can of course in AppOmni deploy these configuration posture policies, data access policies, functional policies across your full stack. So that could be your Salesforce Dev, UAT, prod environment. So we can provide continuous monitoring across your different stacks, and you'll get central visibility into what's happening. So that's what we offer out of the box with AppOmni. But I also want to talk about how we can integrate this into your Flowsome DevOps process, because I think the key thing here is that you want to have some kind of gate in place. So when you go through your promotion to production, there's no point in promoting anything into production that introduces risks. So the flow we're looking at here is you define your security policies. That could be configuration checks, it could be data access policies, it could be functional policies, it could be compliance related policies. So if you look at AppOmni at the bottom, you configure all these things we talked about a few minutes ago. And then from Flowsome, when you go through your promotion process or your DevOps process, you call out to AppOmni via our APIs. We kick off a scan, in this case, against your dev or staging environment. And if that scan comes back with any findings, you basically pause the promotion and you don't take any actions in Flowsome. So you push that now back to the DevOps, not the DevOps, but the Salesforce team, and you start to remediate these findings. When you're ready for the next pass, you just from Flowsome will do the same thing, call the same policies again, check the results. And when you get to a point where all these security related checks passes, of course, Flowsome can then take the action and promote into production. So it's a great way to integrate these security baselines into your DevOps process and catch them early, and use something like AppOmni as your gatekeeper before you promote to production. So I have one or two more slides, and then we'll probably open it up for questions. So just from a high level point of view, we won't necessarily have time to get into all the details, but if we look at the steps on the left side here, I think it's pretty clear how that integration can work or will work, where the first piece is you and us and Flowsome together will define what are these baselines you want to enforce before you approve moving things to production. So it can be a single policy, it can be multiple policies. So that's number one at the top. And when you have that defined, as we talked about before, then you have call outs happening from Flowsome, kick off these policies, wait for the scans to come back from Salesforce. And then based on the findings, we of course feed those findings into Flowsome. Flowsome can then make the decision to promote or pause the promotion. And if any findings are found, then of course, whoever receives those notifications, it can be back into Flowsome, it could be sent back into a change management process. You can easily go into AppOmni, you can start to analyze these findings, and you can of course also consume these findings from anywhere else. So if you want our findings to go into an existing change management process, if you wanted to go back into Flowsome, whatever you want, you can consume these things from different places. So last slide, and then we'll open it up for questions. I want to also encourage all of you, if you are interested in learning more, go to our website, click the request a demo on the right top corner, and that will also take you to an area where you can request a risk assessment, which is usually a 1-hour engagement on our site. We can get connected to your Salesforce environment. We can start to kick off some of these baseline policies that we come with, and we can start to give you visibility into the current state of your Salesforce environment. That's usually a good place to start, and then we can start to look at how we can, of course, integrate into your DevOps flows and make that happen. So with that said, I'll probably pause, and I know we have still a few minutes, so if there are any questions that's outstanding, happy to take them. And so probably back to you, Haley, if you have any questions that's outstanding.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. All right, so we do have questions. I'm going to start on the first one. How does AppOmni collect information from Salesforce?
Yep, good question. So we use standard Salesforce APIs. I forgot to mention in the beginning, we are an API-based solution. First of all, AppOmni is a SaaS-based solution. We leverage APIs to connect to Salesforce. We don't need any inline components. We don't need any infrastructure changes. We use all the standard APIs. We then consume that, analyze that, and report that back in our console and send it into your monitoring infrastructure.
All right, awesome. So the next question is, how many API calls does a normal scan usually consume?
Yeah, we are very light. I don't have the exact number in front of me, but we are deployed in very large environments, and we do not hit any API limits there. We have optimized things on our side, and the way we optimize things is, of course, when you install AppOmni into Salesforce, we do install a list of Apex classes and things like that as well. So when you call out to Salesforce, we use some of our Apex classes and Cloud Code to optimize how we collect data from Salesforce and report that back. But the key thing here is we haven't hit limits in even very large deployments. So again, it's very light on APIs.
Awesome. All right. So next question is, Salesforce actually sent out an email last week about public sites and guest users. Is this the same issue?
Yeah, no, it's a good question as well. And most of you probably received this, where the email that went out is definitely related to some of the topics we talked about earlier, especially related to guest user access or anonymous access into Salesforce. And I think I showed you a number that 55% plus of these engagements we do, we unfortunately see that customers do have data exposed to the external world, anonymous users in this case. So the short answer is definitely, and that's something we've been able to address for quite some time and can help you address as well. So.
Okay, great. So we have one more, well, we have many more questions, but we have another question. Is AppOmni available in Salesforce Government Cloud?
I need to go back and double check on that. Our backend runs in a SaaS backend, and I need to double check if we can, if there's anything I need to be aware of there. So let me take that offline, and then I'll get back to you and we can communicate that back. Okay.
Okay, awesome. And we will be sharing any unanswered questions as well with AppOmni. So all questions will be answered. Next question is, do most pen tests see these issues?
So I think the main difference there is that pen tests is a point in time assessment. Customers usually do them once a year. And as we talked about earlier, these SaaS environments are very dynamic environments, and you constantly see updates getting pushed from both the SaaS vendor itself, but also you have multiple SaaS administrators in the systems. So I think pen tests is usually not an efficient way to stay on top of this. You really need continuous monitoring that monitors your environment on an hourly basis, daily basis, weekly basis. So you can argue some of the same things will be covered, but I think on the other side, it's the continuous monitoring piece that brings a lot of value to the table. And I think especially data access monitoring is really hard to do. And that's something where I think we shine, and we have definitely spent a lot of time on covering that. So overall, I think we have a lot of value to bring to the table to do both instant monitoring, but also continuous monitoring across these environments.